Welcome, dear students. Our current session is on Australia, the First Fleet. I hope and expect by the end of this session you will understand how English reached Australia and how it got its roots there. Well, in 1788, after an 8-month voyage from Portsmouth 11 British ships, the First Fleet, as it is always called, with convicts, marines and civilians aboard, it anchored in Botany Bay on the eastern coast of Australia. This was the first ever, group of people who came there or who landed on this land. The bay had been given this name after Joseph Banks and his fellow botanist Daniel Solander, who had observed many plants here on the land. But Arthur Phillip, who was the captain of this first fleet and the first appointed governor of New South Wales, found this bay as very unsuitable to live there, and he decided that they would move somewhere else. He decided landing at Port Jackson, which is now known as Sydney Harbour. So, in other words, what we can say is that the first fleet anchored on this harbour, the Sydney Harbour, on 26th of January 1788. So, this was the date where exactly, the foundations of modern or today's Australia were laid. Considering its consequences, if we think of the first fleet, actually the first fleet was not very impressive. It was not a huge fleet, I would say. It was rather a very small-sized fleet. This had only 11 ships that carried 1,000 men and women. And, my dear students, it's very interesting how, history has its own stories, very intriguing stories. This first fleet of 1,000 people who were transported to this newly discovered land, they were all criminals. They were all convicts. They were actually all sent there as a punishment. Most of them were transported there to that area of New South Wales, for a punishment of staying there for 7 years. It was more like a life sentence, I would say. Why? Because there were very meager chances of coming back from there. There were very little opportunities for returning back to the British Isles. So, over the next 80 years, 160,000 convicts were sent to Australia. People would be transported from the British Empire to this newly found land, Australia, to punish them. They would be the convicts, they would be the criminals, to keep them, isolated from the rest of the society. They would be sent there. In New South Wales, transportation had ceased by 1840, but it continued to Tasmania until 1852 and to the west until 1868. Now, of course, when these people came here, of course, they brought English language with them. The language that they brought to Australia was essentially late 18th century English. Because they came from the British areas, of course, that was the language that they brought with them. The precise origins of the Australian accent, however, are unknown. We do not find any evidence in the history to know as such from where this Australian accent came. The older view about that is that it is the Cockney, dialect, because most of the people that came from the British Isles, probably most of these convicts belong to that area. However, this view is not held anymore as very appropriate, perspective. Mostly scholars agree that from the earliest settlements, there was a range of British accents that were brought. Because, of course, from all over the Britain, the convicts would be brought to Australia. So a lot of varieties of English came. However, because by that time in England, a standard London variety had emerged, of course, that came as a very strong variety. The early Australians were largely working class people. They were working class townsfolk, and many of them were Londoners. However, the situations changed with the passage of time, and actually it was somewhere in the midst of the 19th century, precisely talking about that 1851, that the discovery of gold was made. And this discovery of gold accelerated the immigration process. Now, of course, more people would be interested to come to Australia. So that, if you look at the time span, within 10 years, the settlers' population hugely increased, and 1.2 million people, that is threefold number, increased within 10 years. The gold rush also brought to an end all that process of transportation of convicts to this. Because these convicts were brought here, why? Because they were to be isolated from the British society and they were to be punished. This was like an isolated land where there were no opportunities of life. So as a punishment, they were sent here. Now that, it was a prospering area with more opportunities after this discovery of gold, there was no point in sending these convicts here anymore. So this transportation stopped. From this time, the pattern of immigration gradually changed, and, Australia became increasingly populated by people of different nationalities. People from different countries, from different nationalities, started preferring to come to Australia to explore these new opportunities. But the first large-scale non-British or non-Irish immigration did not occur until after the Second World War. And it was actually after the Second World War that the foundations for modern Australia, I would say, were laid. This was the beginning of becoming a multicultural immigration country, attracting South and East Europeans. And in recent years, of course, a lot of Asians are, also attracted towards it. As far as English language in Australia is concerned, it was only after the Second World War that the standard Australian variety of English was recognized, and from there onwards, it has emerged as a strong and distinct variety.